23 stab wounds. That is what my closest friends, the men I had pardoned, promoted and trusted with my life, gave me on the floor of the Senate on the 15th of March in the year 44 before Christ. I saw Brutus among them, and I stopped fighting. Not because the wounds had taken my strength, but because when the man you loved like a son drives a blade into you, something more fundamental than the body gives way. That is how the most powerful man in the Roman world ended his life. And this is the story of how he got there. I am Gaius Julius Caesar, born in Rome in the year 100 before Christ into a patrician family of ancient lineage and almost no money. The Julian family claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself through the Trojan hero Aeneas, a piece of mythology that I deployed throughout my political career with a straight face and complete conviction, because in Rome the line between religion and politics was always thinner than it appeared. My family had the name. What we lacked was the wealth, the connections, and the raw political muscle that actually determined who rose and who fell in the Roman Republic. I spent my entire life building all three from scratch, and the story of how I did it is a story about intelligence, audacity, timing, and a willingness to take risks that made every sensible person around me genuinely frightened on my behalf. My father died when I was 15. Leaving me the head of a household with aristocratic pretensions and a very modest income. Rome in my youth was a city of extraordinary violence and political instability. The general Sulla had marched his legions on Rome itself, something that Roman law explicitly prohibited, and had established a dictatorship maintained through a system of proscriptions. Published lists of men who could be killed by anyone with their property then confiscated by the state. My family had connections to Sulla's enemies. My uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, the great general and reformer who had been Sulla's most bitter rival. And my wife Cornelia was the daughter of another of Sulla's enemies. Sulla ordered me to divorce her. I refused. I was 16 years old, refusing a dictator who had already put thousands of men to death. Sulla's advisors urged him to have me executed. Sulla looked at me and reportedly said that in this boy he saw many Mariuses. He let me live. I left Rome immediately and spent years in military service in Asia, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Sulla's reach. It was during those years in Asia that something happened which reveals everything about the kind of man I was becoming. Traveling by sea, my ship was captured by pirates operating in the Aegean, a constant danger in that period when piracy had essentially taken control of the entire eastern Mediterranean. The pirates held me for ransom, demanding 20 talents of silver for my release. I told them they were insulting me. A man of my standing was worth at least 50. I made them send for 50. While waiting for the ransom to be collected, I spent several weeks as the pirate's prisoner, and by every account that survives, I treated the entire situation with a cheerful contempt that the pirates apparently found simultaneously amusing and deeply unsettling. I wrote poetry and made speeches and demanded that they be quiet when I wanted to sleep. I told them repeatedly, and with complete apparent sincerity, that when I was free, I would come back and have them all executed. They laughed. They thought I was joking. The ransom arrived and I was released. I immediately hired ships, found the pirates at their base, captured every single one of them, and had them crucified, exactly as I had promised. I did arrange for their throats to be cut first as a gesture of mercy, because I had rather liked some of them personally. But I crucified them, a promise is a promise. I returned to Rome after Sulla's death and began the long climb through the Roman political system that was the only legitimate path to power in the Republic. I spent money I did not have on public games and entertainments that won me the love of the Roman people. I formed a political alliance with the two most powerful men in Rome, the immensely wealthy Crassus and the great general Pompey, a partnership that history calls the First Triumvirate. Together, we were unstoppable. Separately, each of us was formidable. Together, we controlled Roman politics so completely that the Senate had essentially become a stage set for decisions made elsewhere. I was elected consul in 59 before Christ and used that year to push through legislation that benefited all three of us and left our enemies grinding their teeth in impotent fury. But what I needed was what every Roman politician ultimately needed if he wanted to be taken seriously in the long term: military glory and the loyalty of an army. I got the governorship of Gaul, the territory covering modern France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany, and I spent the next 9 years conducting the most consequential military campaign in the history of the Roman Republic. The Gallic Wars were not simply a military conquest. They were the making of Julius Caesar as a figure of world historical importance. I wrote about them myself in my own account, The Gallic Wars, written in the third person with a modesty so calculated it was almost theatrical, and that account became one of the most read texts in the history of Latin literature. The Gauls were not the disorganized barbarians that Roman propaganda liked to portray. They were sophisticated peoples with complex political structures, skilled metalworkers, accomplished traders, and, when united under a capable leader, formidable warriors. The challenge of Gaul was not any single battle, but the endless complexity of managing shifting alliances, putting down rebellions that reignited the moment your back was turned, and supplying and moving an army across a vast and unfamiliar territory against enemies who knew every valley and forest path. I proved in Gaul that I could do all of these things simultaneously with a speed and adaptability that left my opponents perpetually off balance. My greatest test came in 52 before Christ, when the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix managed something no Gallic leader before him had achieved. He united virtually all of the Gallic tribes under his command into a single coordinated resistance. He chose to avoid pitched battles and instead use scorched earth tactics, destroying food supplies, and using the land itself as a weapon against my army. The decisive confrontation came at Alesia, where Vercingetorix took his forces into a fortified hilltop position and waited for a massive Gallic relief army to arrive and crush me between two forces. My response was one of the most audacious engineering feats in military history. I built 2 rings of fortifications simultaneously, an inner ring to contain Vercingetorix, and an outer ring facing outward to defend against the relief army. My forces were outnumbered from both directions. The relief army alone outnumbered my entire force. I held both rings. The relief army was defeated. Vercingetorix surrendered, riding out of Alesia alone on his horse, fully armed and in his finest war gear, circling my position once before dismounting and laying his weapons at my feet. It was the most dignified surrender I ever witnessed. I kept him prisoner for 6 years, and then had him displayed in my triumph in Rome before his execution. It was the requirement of Roman tradition, and I did not enjoy it. While I was in Gaul, Rome was tearing itself apart. Crassus had been killed in a catastrophic military defeat in Parthia. Pompey had drifted into alliance with my enemies in the Senate, and the Senate, terrified of what I had become after 9 years of military success and the loyalty of 10 hardened legions, ordered me to disband my army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They knew what that meant as well as I did. Without my army and without the legal immunity that came with active command, I would be immediately prosecuted by my enemies on charges that would end my political career and quite possibly my life. The Senate had given me a choice that was not really a choice at all. On the night of the 10th of January in 49 before Christ, I stood on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the boundary that Roman law forbade any general to cross with his army under arms. On one side of that river, I was a Roman commander within his legal authority. On the other side, I was a rebel. I stood there for a long time. There are moments in a life where everything that came before and everything that might come after converges into a single decision that cannot be unmade. I looked at my officers. I looked at the river. I said the words that have echoed through history ever since. The die is cast. And I crossed. What would you have done standing on that bank? Everything you had built over 30 years of political struggle and military campaign on one side, and the certain destruction of everything you were on the other. There are people who say I had no choice. There are people who say I chose power over the Republic. The truth is more complicated than either verdict, and I have had a long time to think about it. I crossed because the alternative was not retirement. It was annihilation. And because I genuinely believed that what I would build on the other side of that river would be better than what the Senate in its current form was capable of maintaining. The civil war that followed was swift by the standards of Roman history. Pompey and the Senate fled Italy, stunned by the speed of my advance. I pursued them across the Mediterranean in a campaign that took me to Spain, Greece, and ultimately Egypt. Pompey was killed before I could reach him, stabbed on a beach in Egypt by agents of the Egyptian king who thought they were doing me a favor. When I arrived and was presented with his head, I turned away and wept. He had been my ally, my father-in-law, the husband of my daughter Julia, who had died years before. Whatever we had become to each other by the end, we had once been something better than enemies. Egypt was where I met Cleopatra, the exiled queen who had herself smuggled into my presence, rolled inside a linen sack, and who in the space of a single conversation demonstrated a mind as sharp and a political instinct as refined as any I had encountered in 30 years of Roman politics. I restored her to her throne. I had a son with her, Caesarion. I placed her golden statue in the Temple of Venus in Rome, a gesture that outraged Roman opinion, and that I made without apology, because I was past the point of governing my actions by Roman opinion. I had crossed the Rubicon. The time for managing perceptions was behind me. I returned to Rome and was appointed dictator, eventually dictator in perpetuity, a title that had no precedent in Roman history, and that my enemies correctly understood as the end of the Republic in everything but name. I reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with one modification by Pope Gregory in 1582, is still the calendar the world uses today. I reformed the courts, reorganized the provinces, extended Roman citizenship more broadly, and began planning a massive campaign against Parthia to avenge the death of Crassus. I was not done. I was never done. That was perhaps the thing about me that most frightened the men who decided I had to be stopped. There were warnings. My wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of my death. and begged me not to go to the Senate on the 15th of March. A soothsayer had warned me months earlier to beware the Ides of March. I had been told that a conspiracy existed. I dismissed the warnings with the particular impatience of a man who has survived too much to take seriously the idea that his own end might be near. I went to the Senate. There were 60 of them in the conspiracy. Senators, many of the men I had pardoned after the Civil War. Men I had promoted and trusted and treated with a generosity that I had believed would purchase their loyalty. Brutus was among them, the man I had loved since he was young, whose mother, Servilia, had been the great love of my life, a man I had pardoned after he fought against me at Pharsalus, and whom I had elevated to the highest positions in my administration. When I saw his face among the blades, I stopped covering my wounds with my toga and pulled it over my head so that I would fall with dignity. I wonder sometimes, in the way that the dead have time to wonder, whether my greatest mistake was not crossing the Rubicon or accepting the dictatorship, but simply believing that men who had once been enemies could be made into genuine friends through the gift of mercy. Perhaps some debts can only be paid in the currency of resentment. My death did not save the Republic. That is the final irony that I carry. The men who ended my life believed they were liberating Rome from a tyrant and restoring the Republic to its former glory. Instead, they unleashed 13 years of civil war that was bloodier and more destructive than anything I had ever set in motion. My adopted son, Octavian, the young man I had named as my heir in my will, a choice that shocked everyone who knew us both, proved to be a political genius of a different kind than mine. Patient where I was impatient, cold where I was warm, calculating where I was instinctive. He destroyed all of my assassins. He destroyed Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And then he became Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, and ruled for 40 years in a peace and stability that the Republic had never managed. Everything the assassins feared I would become, my heir actually became, and the world thanked him for it. History has a sense of humor that is not always easy to appreciate from the inside. I wonder what you think, now that you have heard all of it. Was I a liberator or a destroyer? A visionary who saw that the Republic was already dead and simply gave it a more honest burial? Or a man whose ambition consumed something that might have been saved? I have heard both arguments made by very intelligent people for over 2,000 years, and I do not think either side is entirely wrong. What I know is this. Rome before me was a city consuming itself in cycles of violence that no institutional reform had been able to stop. Rome after me became the greatest empire the Western world has ever known. I am not claiming sole credit for that transformation, but I am not prepared to pretend I had nothing to do with it. I am Julius Caesar, consul, general, dictator, the man who crossed the Rubicon and changed the world on the other side. And although 60 senators believed that 23 wounds would be enough to erase what I had built, here I remain. In the calendar every person on this earth uses to mark their days. In the title of Caesar that became the word for emperor in a dozen languages across 2,000 years. In every moment that a person looks at an impossible situation and decides that the only honest response is to move through it rather than around it. The die was cast on the banks of the Rubicon, and it has never stopped rolling.